Welcome to the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies 2020 Distinguished Alumni Lecture. My name is Erin Corcoran, and I'm the Executive Director of the Kroc Institute for International Peace Studies and an Associate Teaching Professor at the Keough School for Global Affairs. So due to COVID-19 this year, we're hosting our Distinguished Alumni Lecture virtually. And while I am very bummed that I can't have the opportunity to meet and share a meal in person with our honoree tonight or today, I'm also excited about the fact that this virtual event allows for so many of our alumni from around the world to be able to participate and be part of the conversation today. And at the Kroc Institute, we are constantly aware that the accomplishments and fascinating career paths our alumni are a source of pride at the Institute. Since 1987, when the first 4 students were awarded a concentration in peace studies, the Kroc Institute has graduated over 1,800 alumni. This includes over 1,100 from the undergraduate major or minor in peace studies, over 600 alumni from the master's program, and 26 students from our doctoral program in peace studies. Now at work in over 100 countries around the world, Kroc alumni have found a variety of ways to integrate peace studies into their professional work over the last 3 decades. Some of them identify as professional peace builders, while others have found ways to incorporate the knowledge and values of peace studies in a variety of distinct professions, from religious leadership to teaching to parenting. The Kroc Institute's Distinguished Alumni Award honors graduates of Notre Dame's Peace Studies program whose careers and lives exemplifies the ideals of international peace building. And I'm just going to list a few of our past awardees just to give you a sense of the breadth and depth that our alumni are, of the work they're doing out in the field. In the past, we have honored human rights lawyers and advocates, including Shabi Aguirre at the International Criminal Court, Vienna Colucci of Amnesty International, and Adriana Quiones of UN Women. Also Ambassador Juana Popa of Romania, Chinese filmmaker Dijin Yi, Kenyan NGO leader George Wachira, development innovator Molly Kinder, educator and activist Carsona Wise Whitehead of Baltimore, Nigerian journalist Obi Akadibi, Burmese Burmese peace builder Mai Nini Aung, and theater director and writer P. Carl. And to this list of distinguished alumni, we are now privileged to add Bina D'Costa, Professor of International Relations and researcher of migration, gender, and human rights at the Coral Bell School of Asia Pacific Affairs at the Australian National University. And I now invite Ann Hayner, who is the Associate Director of Alumni Relations at the Kroc Institute, to introduce the 2020 Distinguished Alumni Award winner. Thank you, Ann.
Thank you, Erin. I'd like to begin this evening by acknowledging our presence here at Notre Dame on the traditional homelands of Native peoples, including the Haudenosaunee, Miami, Peoria, and particularly the Pokagon Potawatomi, who have been using this land for education for thousands of years and continue to do so. We hope that our celebration tonight will honor the traditions of these Native peoples as we recognize a guest whose work is committed to justice and human rights. We are delighted tonight to welcome Bina D'Costa, a distinguished graduate of the Kroc Institute whose work bridges the worlds of peace studies and peace building. Bina recognizes the intersections between issues of migration, human rights, political violence, transitional justice, environment, and gender, and employs the tools of research, teaching, and policy advocacy to advance the goals of justice and peace. Bina is actually a great example of a scholar practitioner, a concept we often talk about at the Kroc Institute, someone who combines the study and research of peace with the practice of peace building. Bina has had stellar academic achievements. In addition to her master's in international peace studies from the Kroc Institute, Bina holds a master's in international relations with honors from the University of Dhaka and a doctorate in international relations from the Australian National University. When she was promoted to full professor at the Australian National University last year, Bina was only the second woman to achieve that rank in the 70-year history of her international relations department. and the first woman of color to do so. She also serves as the inaugural Associate Dean of Inclusion, Diversity, Equity, and Access for the ANU College of Asia and the Pacific. Working at the nexus of development, human rights, and security in South Asia, Bina's research has included peacebuilding, justice and war crimes trials, human security and borders, gender, children and war, and the role of non-governmental organizations in social movements. She is the author, co-author, or editor of several books, including Nation Building, Gender and War Crimes in South Asia, Children and the Global Politics of Conflict, and most recently, Cascades of Violence, War, Crime, and Peacebuilding across South Asia. In addition to her research and teaching, Bina has had significant policy influence. She has worked as a senior United Nations staff member, most recently at UNICEF, to build its research program on migration and displacement. As a frontline researcher and humanitarian practitioner, she has worked on refugee emergencies in Europe and the Horn of Africa, and served with the UN's ROHINGYA Emergency Response Team in Cox's Bazar, Bangladesh. Bina has provided technical advice on transitional justice for the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda, the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, and the International Crimes Tribunal of Bangladesh, and has supported civil society transitional justice initiatives in Pakistan, Sri Lanka, and Cambodia. She has also worked with indigenous groups in the Chittagong Hills tracts of Bangladesh and alongside Rohingya, Tamil, and Afghan refugee networks. Next year, Bina will undertake a new adventure, taking a 3-year leave from ANU to move to Greece, where she will continue doing research in cooperation with the refugee communities, this time in Lesbos. We are delighted to welcome Bina back to the Kroc Institute to address the topic, No Place for Children, Untangling Refugee Bodies and Navigating Through Crisis in Humanitarian Protection, and to present her with a symbol of our respect. Bina, the Kroc Institute is proud to recognize your dedication to working for a more just and peaceful world through engaged research, teaching, and policy advocacy, and to confer on you the Distinguished Alumni Award of the Kroc Institute. As inscribed on the base of the award, we are confident you will go forth in peace. Congratulations, Bina, and welcome back to the Kroc Institute.
Thank you so much for this generous introduction, Anne. A very good morning to you all from Canberra, Australia. I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and pay my respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emerging. I'm deeply honored and humbled to receive this award from my alma mater, the Kroc Institute, University of Notre Dame. Indeed, it takes actually a whole village to raise a woman. My village, my community includes my family, my friends, and team of colleagues and collaborators who have supported me, inspired me, worked with me, and lifted me up in difficult times with their love, positive energy, and strength. Very special thanks to my parents, Bina D'Costa and Bina D'Costa, for letting me go without a husband to the US in mid-90s. Not a lot of single women left for overseas to study at that time. In Notre Dame, I was also taught by some of the most inspiring scholars I know. To name only a few, Professor Robert Johansson, Professor Caroline Nordstrom, Professor George Lopez, and Professor Gil Losha. Anne Hena, our Associate Director of Alumni Relations, has been an incredible pillar of support and from the beginning, and helped us navigate through the different systems of life in South Bend and patiently endured our complaints. Through her, now we are all connected wherever we are. A big shout out to my Notre Dame friends. I have some of them on my PowerPoint. I'll show you in a minute. Now, I'm the second person to receive this award from my group. after Obi Anaidike, the senior Africa editor for the New Humanitarian. I also know that so many of my friends from my year and from other years are doing incredibly important work. So a big shout to all of them. Thanks also to my sisters who have always been my champion, even at times when we had serious explosive fights with each other. My in-laws, Margaret and Roger Killam. I thank them for their love and support. When I served in the Rohingya emergency, Margaret traveled from Australia to Italy to help look after my children. Anish and Pia, my twins, and my partner David have always understood when I had to leave them to do other kinds of work. They are my anchor. So I thank you all for this incredible honor. With that, I'd now like to share my screen so you can see my PowerPoint. So these are my friends from my year in Notre Dame. And I have some of them here as well during our graduation, and at the below with Katya and friends in ISA, where many of us now also meet. My lecture today is about, the title is No Place for Children, Untangling Refugee Bodies and Navigating Through Crisis in Humanitarian Protection. What I thought I would do is just offer a snapshot of the larger work where I look at the issues of this whole significance of bodies and how we talk about how we use the language of crisis and protection. The now iconic image of 3-year-old Aylan Kurdi's body that washed up on a beach in Turkey in September 2015 sparked a public outcry and turned the world's attention to Europe's forced migration dilemmas involving children. Since then, Aylan's image has been replaced with many, many others, like him and also unlike him. While he has been quickly left unremembered, the recurrent, multi-layered, yet somehow homogeneous narrative of a very large number of children displaced invokes anxiety, demands our attention, and underlines a central problem. We simply do not know enough about the dynamics of the complexities of children and young people on the migration pathway. There are a lot of assumptions about children's migration and displacement, but not enough research-informed understanding of this phenomenon. So in my research, I do a massive discourse analysis of the deployment of language of crisis in situations of mass displacement and humanitarian protection. Crisis in the UN emergency response, where I served in L3 emergency response. That's the highest level of response, the Syrian refugee response in the Horn of Africa, and also in the Rohingya emergency that requires a whole mobilization of the UN humanitarian system in its whole, and it's quite complex. So in terms of that, what I'm talking about, that this emergency response system, it offers an opportunity to garner urgent support from the international community. For example, the UNICEF Humanitarian Action for Children appeals, it strategically and repeatedly applies the discourse of crisis to channel resources, including experts for the frontline. While the initial global response to the crisis discourse evoked at the height of emergency service purposes, this is always not sustainable. Crisis, as the primary and defining category, in the case of Europe, evoked a sense of danger and threat to refugees, particularly to young men crossing the central and eastern Mediterranean routes to arrive in Lampedusa, Italy, and to what we know as the jungle in Calais, in France, that they already carried with them. Thousands of children crossing the Naf River over in the Bangladesh-Burma border in August 2017 originally was met with sympathy. By mid-2018, this served to severe resentment by the host community in Cox's Bazar. So through a post-colonial lens, this discussion about crisis and saving strangers, in this case, saving refugees, could be observed as a very distinct type of othering of us versus them. Indiscriminate labeling of crises incentivize states to render refugees as savages in desperate need of rescuing and to introduce extraordinary measures with disregard for civil liberties and human rights. From the US to Niger to Europe to Bangladesh, this narrative of young victims and states as their primary saviors are evident. Interestingly, civil society actors, including community groups, they challenge these portrayals and they shape empowering agendas of protection. So in my work, I argue that there is an urgent need to decolonize humanitarian protection, but this could only be done when we examine various kinds of innovative measures that are operationalized by Global South states and also civil society actors in cooperation with the international community. Just bear with me. I think I can't go to the next slide. Let's see if I can, okay. Now, leaving one's birthplace to move to a new place has been one of the central features of human civilization. An estimated 214 million people worldwide are international migrants, and 740 million people are internal migrants. For many, migration provides a tremendously positive experience. Yet migration can also be stressful in the best of circumstances. Packing up one's belongings, relocating, and settling in a new place can be quite daunting for anyone. When this experience is full of stress and anxiety, either because of pressures to move, the conditions under which one is forced to move, or even the kind of journeys one must take to reach her destination, it could be extremely difficult. Indeed, the contemporary histories of migration is replete with stories of conflict, persecution, economic hardship, and trauma. Data from UN agencies tell us that we are now witnessing the highest levels of displacement on record. An unprecedented 65.3 million people around the world have been forced to leave home. Among them, nearly 21.3 million refugees. There are 10 million stateless people. Though the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Refugees provides most of the data for displaced persons, there is not enough precise collection, analysis, and distribution of age and sex disaggregated data on overall migration. A very large number of children, displaced children, they live in camps or in settlements. Many of them live in undocumented locations. What we do know is that children represent about half of the displaced population globally, as you can see from this slide. Children cross borders within and outside states in varying circumstances and for different reasons, both voluntarily and also involuntarily. In a broad sense, economic, socio-political, and environmental motivations influence children and their parents to migrate. Poverty has traditionally been one of the main drivers of child migration, particularly from rural to urban locations. What we also know now is that the poorest cannot so easily migrate to another country because you do need resources to migrate. Children are also trafficked to provide labor, or they're forced to move because of political violence or environmental disasters. Although the international and domestic migration of children also occur frequently, it is perceived, although of course incorrectly, as an ordinary everyday phenomenon. On the other hand, international migration of children is now more evident, and because of conflict-induced migration, it is understood as a distinct, dangerous, and traumatic event. Mobility pathways deeply impact a child's development, and as a consequence, the future of our world. We need to understand migration patterns because they matter. So in this way, child-sensitive and child-responsive research is incredibly important, and they can explain the intricate dynamics not captured by the more general research on migration. While vast amounts of data now exist chronicling the lives of migrants, we have less understanding of the movement of young people and children. So I use the languages interchangeably. Children are between 0 to 18 years old, but when we talk about children on the move from UNICEF, it means 3 to 18 years old. Young people between 15 to 24 years old. And when we are talking about adolescents, it's between 10 to 19 years old. So there are lots of different ways we are actually categorizing children. On the other hand, the national action plans for different countries, for example, in Somalia or in Afghanistan, when they're talking about children and young people, they actually talk about people who are below 35 years of age. Then also, of course, we have social constructions of childhood and of youth. So to our parents and to our grandparents, we'll always remain young and will also be understood as the younger generation. So there are, of course, different kinds of categories of childhood that are constructed, both socially and also legally. So when we are talking about children and young people and the migration pathway, they are in receiving, in transit, and in origin societies. Historically, they've been more tolerant of the migration of children and of young people for a range of reasons. On one hand, societies often have an exploitative interest in child migrants who are valued for their labor. On the other, there actually also exists genuine compassion and recognition that the international community must commit to supporting child migrants. The complex and often conflicting priorities of countries change over time, and protection measures can be curtailed or rendered ineffective by government policies or shifting context. Bangladesh, for example, provided a high level of initial support for Rohingya refugees who arrived between 25th of August to 3rd September 2017. But over the next 2 years, proceeded to introduce many restrictions that curtailed basic rights. Italy provided reception facilities for unaccompanied and separated children, but many started to go missing from the facilities following mismanagement and abuse in those facilities. Nordic countries, Norway, Sweden, Finland, Iceland, and Denmark, they allowed education and health services, but did very little to facilitate access to the system in order to discourage children and their families to seek refuge in these countries. So we have actually varying ways children and their families, they're received. And although we have laws, we have some sort of international protection framework, there are actually implementation gaps. So it's not only through laws we can think about protection, we need to target and we need to understand those implementation gaps through which children's rights and their families' rights are regularly violated. So here in my last few minutes, what I want to offer to you is a socio-legal framework that talks about vulnerabilities, protections, and protection risks and rights. So what we know in terms of children who are in the migration pathway is there are four very massive kind of complex problems that affect children. One is forced return and voluntary return. We can talk about that in the US. Many of you would be very familiar with this discussion of return. And from Europe, we also know that many have been returned. Then detention. There are many children who live in detention. The numbers also vary. In Australia, for example, children also are in Manus Island. There are children who are in detention centers. trafficking and smuggling, there are intersecting categories. There are a lot of discussions about that from different kinds of perspectives. So trafficking is one way children are targeted, and they are very vulnerable, and it creates certain kind of protection risks. Finally, they're missing children. So children are in reception facilities, and children who are moving with families when they're unaccompanied, or when they're separated. Many times they actually also go missing. Either they go missing voluntarily, or sometimes they are actually targeted by criminal networks and various kinds of networks in countries where they go for sanctuary. So there are many studies that have been done by UNICEF, UNHCR, and IOM particularly, and there are other agencies, particularly those like Save the Children, Plan International, and NGOs in many different countries. They talk about children's rights. So one of the things what we know from some of this from the studies is that there are barriers to safe migration and barrier to safe pathways because of punitive border control measures. The punitive border control measures of different states target children differently. Many times then they have to go underground, they have to seek some sort of services that are offered by smuggling networks and criminal networks. And these networks also target children, but also border control officials, the whole security sector in different parts of different countries, they actually target children. And this targeting is also very much gendered. I can talk about that during the Q&A if we have time. Then there are dangerous interception practices. Then there's, of course, through criminalization of irregular migration, children are left without any protection framework. The mandatory detention policies in different countries. In EU member state, it has changed a little, but they are detained, they feel they are detained in different ways. Their freedom is curtailed in Europe. But we also know that there are many different kinds of detention centers in Asia, in parts of Africa, in North America, but there are different kinds of detention through which freedom of children are curtailed. Then there's unsustainable return policies. Children who come from conflict zones, for example, from Boko Haram targeted areas or Al-Shabaab targeted areas in Nigeria and Somalia, Somaliland, they might be offered protection, but if they are fleeing poverty, then they are not offered protection. In that case, we know that many children who come from different parts of the Horn of Africa or from East Africa, they are not actually offered protection and they're forcibly returned. Same way, children who come from Sri Lanka, who come from Afghanistan, they have been forcibly returned, saying that the situation is relatively peaceful back in the countries, which we know that it is not. So children have been left with a lot of protection measures from not only from transit countries and receiving societies, but then they're forcibly sent back. Violence, exploitation, and abuse are part of the experience of children in terms in their migration pathway, particularly children who have disability, the intersectional kind of exposure to different kinds of violence and exploitation, they are also targeted in very different ways. So I have a photograph here from Jordan's Zaatari camp where I did some work. This is one of the first camps which have a park for children where children who are differently abled, they are also able to access that park. So this is very unique, but not necessarily we see that in different kinds of camps and settlements. So I'll pass this very quickly, but I want to mention that in my work and in the research of many of us who try to talk about and showcase children's experiences, it is drawn from the CRC, the Child Rights Convention, which talks about the best interest principle. So the best interest principle, particularly the services that we see at the forefront and the front line in the humanitarian protection, is about health, about education, about care, and about guardianship, particularly for children who are unaccompanied and separated. More and more, we see young people as young as 5-year-old have crossed borders on their own. So guardianship is also very, very important to offer that kind of support to children. So, but what we see globally is that that there's a clear tendency to give migration law precedence over the CRC. Children have a right to be heard, but often when they are working with the officers who are assessing their asylum claims, they are not heard. And this is a problem we have seen across the globe. Children, they need to participate. Their participation is very, very important to determine the timing and to determine what it means to actually properly offer protection. What we also know that this participation is also not always offered to them. Child participation in the asylum system, we don't see very much. So one of the things that I've done in the Rohingya emergency response, where I served in 2017, so the L3 emergency was activated by the UN on, people started moving from 25th of August in 2017, and the L3 response was activated from 1st of September. So children are at risk of human rights violation due to the conditions they face, not only in the countries of origin that compel them to move, but also in the journey. So then there are also lots of structural context. And here research tells us, and I'm not going to discuss that a lot, but the lack of citizenship, the lack of having birth registration, all of those actually also create vulnerabilities that lead to intersectional risks. Their journeys are long, they're dangerous, and they're multidirectional. Multidirectional in this case, that you see that somebody is moving from Burma, Myanmar, from crossing the border to Bangladesh, but then not wanting to stay in Bangladesh, so embarking on a dangerous journey through the Bay of Bengal and Indian Ocean, through Libya, then cannot go directly through Libya, go to Niger, from Niger, come back to Yemen, or again to Libya, and then cross through the central Mediterranean route to Lampedusa in Italy. So this is what I'm telling you, that this is very complex. People are in those journeys for a prolonged period. One of the persons I've interviewed was in that kind of journey for more than 2 years. They also face a lot of risk at destination. But what we also know is that often researchers are not at the front line. We are often understood as the thinkers, that we just sit in this office space and we think, and then there are the doers who do all sorts of interesting work, but on the front line, but we capture that data and then we analyze it. But what I'm trying to communicate today, and the kind of researcher that Anne mentioned at the beginning about being scholar practitioner, and Notre Dame had instilled that in me, is that yes, we do think a lot, we do critically analyze, but we also do. So you see that here we have this Chatham House dialogue looking at issues of forced return from the UK. And here we had that meeting, particularly taking deep dives in Afghanistan and Nigeria. My colleagues have recently published that from Chatham House. And on the other side, you see me talking to the imams and the majis, who are the community leaders in the camps, talking about menstrual hygiene, of all things, because of very crowded spaces in those camps, how women and girls, they need some space to think about also their sexual and reproductive rights, but also talking about child marriage and early marriage. So issues like that. So from research, we can always bring research through data and evidence, try to convince communities what's important, and also bring knowledge from communities back to research, thinking about what's important. So this is really actually something I want to communicate today. And finally, I want to also discuss, and this is where my new research at the moment is. Now, this is an image that one of our, when I was working in UNICEF, one of our child respondents, she drew this image trying to talk about her trauma and her mental health and what was happening in her community. Now, this research, when you see it on the side by side of the discussion of resilience, a lot of work by UN agencies and also the big donors look at the issues of resilience, trying to really support communities and overcome the shocks of what they experience. But what this image hopefully communicates, and what we need to know, that there are different kinds of resilience we need to think about. There's families resilience, there's communities, then there's state and system. And when we want to create conditions of greater resilience of children and young people that are made vulnerable by actually systems injustice, it means transforming those systems but just targeting families' resilience and individuals' resilience and refugee communities' resilience, it's not enough. We need to think about a transformative society where we need to also look at how systems also create injustices and whether or not it's possible to think about resilience from that kind of perspective. So this is the last slide I have for you that looks at because I joined UNICEF when we were in 2016, when New York Declaration was adopted, and with that two big compacts, the Migration Compact and the Refugee Compact, they were adopted. So I was fortunate enough to contribute to that discussion. Those of you who are joining us from the US know that the US pulled out of the Migration Compact. So did Australia. But many actually American scholars and practitioners and also Australian scholars and practitioners were involved in some of those lobbying and advocacy with states from behind the scene. So we have 6 policy asks in UNICEF, and within those asks, actually in every policy ask, there's a lot of research stream that goes on. And the key deliverables in 1718 were the research I was leading in the child rights framework based interest from Florence in Italy. You see those, actually I tried to offer that to you, that what it, so there were different kinds of research that looks at communication, looks at taking deep dives into discussions of inequality, trying to draw from data from Gallup poll, looking at migration deportation nexus, and strengthening multi-sectoral abuses. So I leave this with you now and pass it on to Susan. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bina. Let me be the first to say what an absolute delight it was to hear you and to be able to listen to your reflections. I have a lot of questions coming in with a lot of different angles, but let me start with asking you a question about your methods and the ways in which you work as a researcher. You've talked, I think, throughout your career about the importance of framing and how we frame questions and issues often leads us in the direction of answers, making some things visible and some things invisible. And you've been very precise about taking kind of different perspectives, sometimes gender, in this case, children, in order to shed broader light on issues in the mainstream. So I wanted to hear you reflect a little bit more about, in this project in particular, what you think the focus on children reveals to us about the broader questions of migration, And then I'd also like to hear you talk a bit about what it's like to be a researcher who is always kind of on the edge of the mainstream, and what it has been like to build a career from that position.
Thank you, Susan. I try to be brave, but I'll come to the last comment that you made about being on the margins of research. So, as you know, Susan, I've written about that in terms of feminist methodologies in international relations, where I looked at what it means to be at the margin of the discipline and trying to talk about particular trying to draw attention to case studies that are less researched in international relations, and also trying to talk about silences, different kinds of silences, particularly silence of victims and survivors of sexual and gender-based violence and wars. So we know that international relations have been traditionally not paying attention to that, but building on to amazing academics, feminist researchers, not only from Aya, but from other disciplines as well. My work have been very much I wouldn't say interdisciplinary. So trying to understand from international law, particularly from international humanitarian law and human rights discourses, and anthropology, sociology, looking at how we can unpack the way we think about gendered analysis of politics. And what it means to be at the margin of a discipline. So from that time and post-colonial theory about this othering of people, us versus them, what it means, we know Edward Said have talked a lot about that. And there, at the moment, globally, we are talking about Black Lives Matter from the US. We are talking, before that, we talked about the Me Too campaign and thinking about and trying to understand previously silenced voices and what it means. So we do have our locations and context. So I tried in my research, what I say at the moment is that margin is a place which is very exciting. We don't need to really worry about trying to make sense in the mainstream. Let mainstream this, the world is so big and there's so many issues. We shouldn't really constantly think about, even 20 years ago, when we were writing our research, we always started thinking about, for example, gaps in the world. But I think we also need to figure out a different ways of speaking and knowing and thinking that what we are building on. So it's not necessarily always the gaps we need to pay attention to, but also the building blocks have changed, shifted. Sometimes we have to be the disruptors, but it means that we also can make margins very powerful, important spaces from where we can bring previously unheard voices to our research. Same way, I have seen in feminist discussion, CEDAW, for example, is obviously, it talks about gender and women's sort of absence and the silences and various ways we talk about the violence against women. But CEDAW in many ways is age blind. On the other way, when we're looking at Child Rights Convention is gender blind. So thinking about trying to combine CEDAW and CRC frameworks, what it means to incorporate a child-centered approach that's also gender sensitive. This is, I think, is the key of my research, because critical feminist methods in international affairs, in international relations, it allows us to think that how we can pay attention to our respondents, how we can bring back to that kind of data and evidence to understand complex questions that we are trying to respond to in global realities, and also do it with very deep sense of feminist ethics, which means paying attention to silences as well and paying respect to that and understanding that not all of that could be captured in academic research. So trying to then connect it, and here peace studies and my work in Notre Dame is very, very valuable, because I learned from Notre Dame that research doesn't have to be it doesn't have to be in academia. I learned it from my amazing peers in my year. I've learned it from others. Not all of them stayed in academia, but we still connect. We still talk about different ways of trying to make sense of some of the things we are working with and dealing with in our everyday life. So I hope that sort of response, Susan. And last point here is that I have published a piece called Learning to be a Compassionate Academic. So those who are joining us, who are interested to look at it, what it means, maybe that will give a bit of sense.
And I can certainly pitch that piece because I use it regularly when I teach. It's a beautiful, beautiful piece. I wanted to bring you back to the question of the child and the perspective of the child. One of the questions that has come in is about the ways in which, when we talk about migration, we're often talking about how to build the agency of the migrant. And I wondered if you could talk a bit about the complexity of that when it comes to children. And what are some of the ways in which it's different and more complicated to talk about the agency of children?
Thank you, Susan. Now, here, this is actually an incredibly important space for us to do more research on and unpacking how we are looking at issues of agency. So I'll give a couple of examples. The first one is it's not an example. We haven't seen the end of it yet, but it's an important one. This is from the United States. In some of the times, and this is why it's sort of like, in my view, unfinished business, is that the case is ongoing. So I won't comment a lot, but in one of the borders, there was one girl who was 7-year-old. She was detained by the immigration officials, and it was after some discussion with the social workers, it was clear that her family availed the services of the smuggling networks. So in that particular border, it is actually not legal to detain children who come through the border, and they have to be immediately they have to be offered protection from social services in that area, particularly the social work system in that area. But in this case, she was the border control authorities. They made her to stay in that with them for 2 days, so that at one point saying that no, you have nothing to fear, but on the other hand saying, tell us the names who have made you across that border and everything. So you see that although this is what I was trying to say, that there are implementation gaps despite massive advocacy or in state by state basis, and also in the countries, that what is happening when we're looking at case by case basis protection of minors. Then you have the problem of those children who are understood as young suspects, particularly boys, when they're between 15 to 18-year-old, who are still children, and they cross, many of them actually look a little bit older because of stress. And then in Europe, in Italy, in the UK, then in Nordic countries, where I have seen it firsthand, is that they were not believed. They're often understood as liars. They say, no, you're not below 18, you're more than 18-year-old. So this constant kind of prejudice that plays of not only officials in the system, but also social workers and others. There's a huge amount of prejudice that plays in this space. So it's an inherently a space that's insecure, and there's no dignity. There's no dignity. I want to make sure that these points comes across, that actually even sometimes social workers and volunteers who work with them, there's a lot of problem and it's not only actually the states who create the problems. There's a lot of prejudice that's communicated through other officials. So you have those kind of things playing a role. So they are offered as guardians, but the guardians we have seen in our research from in the Nordic countries, in Norway and Sweden and Denmark, which are the champions of child rights convention, and they are understood as the champions of best interests principle. But what we've seen is that the guardians, instead of supporting the children, they support the state protection systems and asylum processes. So the guardians are speaking. They often don't ask the children, they don't translate. The translators also don't offer the full kind of understanding. So children who are terribly scared, they don't have their families with them. So often then the system judges them as liars, as concocting stories. So the protection, that's very, very complex. And as you and I hope others know, that people do sometimes talk about different things doesn't mean that they are not victims. So this understanding is completely missed from the system that is so much about honesty, but that honesty is so unjust, the way the truth is framed. What that truth is framed in a very clinical way, but justice for migrant children is very complex, and those who come to the asylum system. So some of that actually simply by looking through legal lens is not it's not very clear for us.
One of the things I found really interesting in looking at this paper was the way in which you talked about how migration and being a refugee has an effect on the development of the child and the developmental impact, and therefore the consequences can go on for years and years and be broadly seen throughout the society. I was wondering how it is that we can get a grasp on some of these developmental issues. And this is maybe, again, a kind of methods question. It's very hard to measure it. It's very hard to get that data. But how can we begin to understand these developmental impacts?
You've rightly pointed out that actually this is a methods question, but it's not only mixed methods question, it's also actually somewhere we could perhaps do some more interdisciplinary research, drawing from science, from neurological study of child development. There are researchers at UC Berkeley who have done this phenomenal study after this longitudinal study looking at the developmental state of children and how actually our brain develops. So what they have argued is that in the first 5 years of a child's life, in that whole in life course, in the first 5 years, that kind of trauma a child is exposed to, it actually stays with that child forever. So sometimes some of that, obviously through family connection, through love and everything, it changes a little bit, but it could always come back. So the first 5 years are the critical age at that time when our brain is developing. So we do know that. And we also know that adolescence is a very, very important, the second decade of life course, as we say. It's a very important time of a child's developmental stage. And at this time, we also see globally that many, many children are exposed to, they take precarious journeys, they're exposed to violence, exploitation, and abuse. So we do know that they carry with them. And that could come up. And here, if we use an ecological model, which in psychology we use, and in peace psychology, many academics have also used that. That ecological model tells us that how that kind of individual experience of trauma that filters through in different ways, what we talk about as intergenerational harm, that the stories are continued to generation as well. So interesting research is being done at the moment on Yemen, where there's a famine going on. And we know that many children have suffered horrific violence and abuse. So what's going to happen in Yemen? So this is an interesting study which from UNICEF, it's being carried out at the moment. Another study which looks at famine in 70s in Biafra region and in Cambodia. So so this study explains that the result came out, I think, and this is from Sweden, it has been done in 2018. So it tells us that those wars in 70s, after that, for 20 years, people who were born, they were always 3 or 4 inches shorter because there was lack of food, and also the trauma, what it means. So it's not only psychological, there's also physical impact we see of trauma and war and famine, and that children actually carry with them. So this intergenerational harm is incredibly important for us to understand the grievances children carry with them, and those grievances, how they are communicated within their families and communities, and how that also actually impact on their decisions, and eventually how we want to think about a just society where there's lots of issues there as well.
Thank you very much. I'm getting a number of questions about asking you to talk a bit more about your understanding of intersectionality and the way what some of your findings have been, but also about how the understanding of intersectionality can be brought into the practice state and in the NGOs, and how can we bring those insights really to bear on the concrete work of organizations and practitioners?
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Susan. I'm hoping, I'm guessing the question about intersectionality came from those who have read a lot of work from obviously Kimberly Crenshaw and many other academics who have talked about intersectionality. So, I'm not going to go into that whole theoretical conversation about it, but in my research, I have discussed that intersectionality in terms of class, culture, location, age, privilege, and caste. So all of that. So that kind of intersectionality, of course, we talk about. Then the other one that's relevant for those joining us from the US is this whole conversation about white privilege and what it means and how we carry that out. So obviously that's very important. But coming from South Asia, my family had, like my parents had different 3 passports in their life, Indian and then Pakistani and then Bangladeshi. And my mother now lives in Canada. So, and so when you're talking about those kinds of changes of that your country becomes a different country and you have different kinds of, at one point you are fleeing wars and you are in an IDP camp in my family's situation, and in the other, you are a privileged migrant. So which means that your privilege also intersects. To understand that, this is something is very important in the work in practice. So the Syrian refugees in Al-Azraq camp or in Zaatari camp, they're highly privileged Syrians because Syrians are educated. Many of them, after 2011, as we know, when they were forced to cross their borders, they had to leave everything behind, other than obviously education. They're highly educated group. So targeting that community to talk about particular things, social norms have to be very different than another kind of group, which is a Rohingya in Bangladesh, which are incredibly, meaning they have been stripped of all sorts of privilege, from registering birth, marriage, and death to actually going to schools. So we are talking about very different kinds of refugee communities. So understanding that refugees also are different. They're not a homogeneous category as victims. There are different kinds of refugees. So this is very, very important in terms of intersectionality when we are working on the ground with communities. So here the last point is about gender. So in 2017, when I was working in the camps, because the Rohingya, there's early marriage and child marriage is something, it's very prevalent there. Same with the Syrian refugees, and we've seen that with the Somali and South Sudanese refugee groups as well. But in the Rohingya case, there's a young mothers group that those are being led by, funded by UNICEF and UNHCR, and operationalized by the local NGOs. So young mothers groups talk about various issues about sexual and reproductive rights and about social norms. Social norms means, how to even wash our hands. That's kind of the things we talk about. So I asked one of the senior leaders who was known everywhere about her experience as a mother. She was 17-year-old. I asked her, so you are a mother, you're leading the young mothers group. She said, no, I'm not married. I said, then why are you leading a young mothers group? She said, well, I'm the only one who can speak English, speak Bengali, and talk to Rohingya. So you see, this is a problem because even NGOs at one level, we are trying to talk about the harm of child marriage and early marriage, yet we frame a young woman, 17-year-old, because of her education as a mother. So this is a problem of where I think intersectionality, we see that we really need to think about in a much more complex, nuanced way. And this work is continuous. We always have to remember and talk about that.
Do you have any concrete suggestions that you would give to NGOs about how to avoid this kind of replication of the privileges? How can they transform the system?
Thank you, Susan. I'm not sure if this is an easy question to answer. Emergencies, I don't know if here's anyone in the audience who have, if you have served in emergencies. I do not, if you have, these are incredibly chaotic, stressful places, meaning at the time of emergency. Obviously, things come down and then you're able to operationalize different things. But emergencies are also understood as entry points. So you have to start immediately about changing some of the social cultural norms. So NGOs, even when they work in emergencies, at the beginning, they work in one kind of way, they change their activities afterwards. So one suggestion is to thinking about drawing from research, this learning and unlearning, that we have to constantly learn, but we also have to constantly unlearn, that the sum of those things, we really need to connect those. I think this is the way we can move forward. So research can contribute to practice, but also practice can also contribute to research. So a lot of conversation has to happen. And here from feminist researchers, we know self-reflection is a very important way of going forward.
Okay. Now I have a question actually from Bob Johansson for you. He says, you have seen much suffering and have reason to be discouraged with insensitive human responses to children's rights. What is the source of your strength and commitment?
Hi, Bob. You know how much I honor you and how much I have learned from you. So thank you for asking this question. When I was in Notre Dame, I don't know if you recall, you asked me something similar about that. And I, at that time, recited a poem by Rumi. So I think my source of strength sometimes is that, and like everyone, is that when we experience this, and in many cases for me, it had been vicarious kind of trauma, looking at people and trying to deal with it, and you carry that one carries that kind of trauma from the front line to everyday life. And it's incredibly messy. And so I think my personality has changed a little bit after working in particularly in these three emergencies, particularly the Rohingya emergency, because there I was from the beginning there, and it was absolutely traumatic. So it's really difficult sometimes to laugh, but I think it's important from music, from the strength from my 6.5-year-old twins, and from the love of my family and friends, to draw that strength from them. It's important. So it's important to actually pay attention to our mental health. So it's not about like really go, 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 that it's important to take time off and to recover, because this work is ongoing for all of us, and it's teamwork. It's collaborative work. It's not individuals. As individuals, we can't transform the world. We can only contribute a little bit. But it's a transformative work. It has to connect all of us, which means that actually offering support, offering strength to others when they need it. So this is how I go on, Bob. And this is what I've learned from you as well.
Thank you very much. I wonder, Bina, if you have some words of advice that you would like to give to our current students and young alumni from your perspective now.
Thank you, Susan. I think one important lesson to learn, not important lesson really, all our paths are very different. I don't really mean that. Let me backtrack a little bit. It's obviously the kind of person I am and the kind of background I had, my family background and where I was coming from. I always carried those lessons from my family and community, and I was incredibly privileged to learn from amazing professors from Notre Dame, and then also to continue that learning in Australia and work with people. So through all of that, I know, and many of you would understand that this privilege is also, there's also a lot of sadness and sorrow and grief. One grief is that sometimes not being able to go back and to the country where I was born in. So I work as a migrant, a highly skilled migrant, of course, but I am serving from somewhere else. And many of you would probably, I'm guessing that you'd have to do that at one point. But that work can always contribute to where we come from. Meaning, where this is something in Notre Dame we always used to joke about. Where have you come from? Oh, so I'm just connecting to that no matter where we are, we can always contribute to our societies where we come from, and also continue that journey forward. And that could also mean that I have been a scholar practitioner and worked well for me. It may not work well for everyone, but so we really have to try to shine the kind of thing we are best at. So either only as academics, or when we're going to public sector or private sector, but thinking about issues of social justice and peace building that's embedded in us, and that's instilled in Notre Dame and elsewhere in our families and in our communities. I think to carry that is important. Also, the other thing is that to take advantage of the alumni network that we have, trying to reach out to others. So we have an amazing network, so talking to others. So there are others who can provide very targeted advice, many of us. So not to hesitate to reach out to us, to any of us. We'd always be there and support our students who are coming from Notre Dame. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to wrap it up. I am very grateful to have had this time to talk with you and to listen to the wisdom that you offer. I want to bring us to a close now. And to those of you who are listening, I wanted to thank you for tuning in, and also to remind you of some of the opportunities that we have open at the Kroc Institute, one of which is the Visiting Alumni Fellowship. So this is a newer fellowship that we have designed that alumni who have graduated prior to 2010 are eligible to apply to come and spend a semester at the Kroc Institute. We're thinking many of you are very immersed in practice but also have ongoing research interests and questions that you'd like to have some time to explore. And so I would encourage you to go to the website, Kroc website, under the research tab. The deadline for the applications for the fellowships are January 1st. And then also, of course, to announce that we are in the midst of accepting applications to the MGA Peace Studies program. So for those of you who are thinking of applying and joining this wonderful group of people, we would welcome your application. The deadline for that is December 15th. So once again, I would like to thank you, Bina, and congratulate you on being one more of our wonderful, amazing alumni.
Thank you, Susan. And thank you to Notre Dame and everyone who joined us today.